A couple of years ago, when the harsh winter had finally finished, and the forest was showing signs of a strong spring in all its multitude of colours, my wife and I decided to go mushroom picking, mainly for morels, but also on the off chance of finding some early boletes. As most villagers also regularly go mushroom picking, we learned early on that we had to find places which hadn't seen droves of Wellington-wearing locals in order to have any chance of finding some good produce. The entranceways to the forest around the village are generally picked clean following the first sunny day after a long rainstorm, as most villagers tend to harvest the areas closest to their homes and not delve that much farther into the woods. We drove a little ways outside the village and parked the car at the rusted gate which blocked the entrance to the logging road, which winds its way up and through dense forest up into the hills. It's about a mile's walk along the logging road before we reach an abandoned logging track on one side. There are many such tracks, evidence of previous logging ventures which, once used, are slowly abandoned and retaken, first by undergrowth and later the trees themselves. This particular logging trail we aimed specifically for because, after following its length for some period of time, it led into a chasm in which a small creek meandered through, and then up the other side into dense, old-growth beech forest. As it was so far out of the way for most villagers, it was the ideal location to find a good amount of mushrooms. We'd done this route a few times previously, and for the first half a mile of picking our way through ferns and the occasional thorn bush, following the deep-rutted tracks of some old logging vehicle, we chatted and looked around, heard the occasional stampede of deer or the angry coughing of red squirrels, and generally enjoyed the coolness of the trees on a warm spring day. Because there were still pockets of mud in the ruts, we split up, my wife taking the left-hand rut and I the right. These now separated by perhaps 15 or 20-year-old pine trees. We kept our eyes on either side of the ruts for any mushrooms that may be growing as we made our way deeper and deeper into the forest, aiming for the chasm. One thing that really puts the villagers off going much further than we were is the undergrowth. Brambles are everywhere and they get really annoying. It's much easier foraging when there isn't much on the ground to catch your boots and trousers. After some distance, I noticed the roof of a cabin up ahead, perhaps 200 feet away towards the end of the trail. I pointed it out to my wife. She, some 10 or 15 feet to my left, spotted it also, and we began talking about buying a cabin in the forest. There are many such cabins in my area. Khatters or dachas, small pointy-roofed wooden buildings which were popular during socialism. For me, they're akin to paradise, although it's very hard to find one in good condition and for a sensible price, as they are again becoming sought after. Having spotted this faded red roof, I was very keen to investigate, as we know the director of the local forest, and perhaps we could make some deal about buying the property. Keeping the roof in sight, my wife continued on the left-hand rut and I continued on the right, sometimes having to move around trees or bend under low-hanging branches, sometimes having to move off the rut completely because of deadfall or too deep puddles. But we still kept on in the cabin's direction. As we walked, my wife and I spoke more about the possibilities of the cabin. Ideally, I wanted a source of fresh water nearby, and we knew that the creek couldn't be too far away from it. However, I was slightly confused because, having done this trail several times in the past, I couldn't recall having ever seen a cabin. But the forest here changes massively depending on the season and depending on the foliage. Some things can be visible and later not, as leaves and branches block your view. I couldn't remember if we'd ever made this trail in the spring before, or just in summer or autumn on the hunt for birch bolete and sep. Once we were within possibly 50 feet of the roof, I could see where the line of trees separating the ruts finished, and we'd finally be able to walk together towards it. So we joined up again and, quite excitedly to be honest at the possibilities, we made our way towards the cabin. Just before we reached the clearing where the cabin would stand off to the left and slightly up the hill, We had to go around a large bush. It required bending over and sort of filtering our way through conifer branches before entering quite an open area. The first question my wife asked upon entering the clearing was, "Where's the cabin?" Once again, I was confused. I realised that for the last 5 or 10 feet we'd had to dodge both undergrowth and overhangs, but we hadn't changed direction, and I too was perplexed as to where the cabin had gone. It should have been directly on our left, but it wasn't. Instead, the area, possibly 100 feet by 100 feet, was dead and grey. There was no undergrowth, which was quite a shock after having hacked our way through it for the last half a mile, and beyond the clearing on all sides was again thick undergrowth. But the clearing, with pine trees behind us and tall, thick old beech trees to the right and ahead, was dead and grey. There was nothing aside from 3 old piles of stacked sawn logs, which obviously once had meant to be collected by the village tractor for someone's winter wood supply, but had rotted, dried and shrunk until they were barely recognisable as logs. Judging by their age, they were many decades old. The area was lifeless, and there was no cabin. The whole clearing gave off this creepy vibe, as though perhaps there had once been a cabin, and now there wasn't. But there were no foundations, and nothing to suggest a building had ever stood there. It left us feeling more than a little uneasy. We had both seen the cabin roof from different angles for a continuous period while we covered quite some distance. It had been a red, peaked, tiled cabin roof of the type commonly seen in our area, but it wasn't there. We'd seen it, and it had vanished. The thing about the grey dead area was that it didn't entice us to stay longer in order to search for whatever the cabin had been. It gave off a very unpleasant and unwelcoming feeling, as though the forest itself didn't encroach on this area. It was an area of death, full of sickness, surrounded by dense greenery. We abandoned our search for the cabin, crossed the dead area, and made our way to the chasm. We went down it, crossed the creek, and clambered up the muddy bank to the other side into the old-growth beech forest to search for mushrooms. For the journey home, we forewent the route we had originally taken and instead navigated with a bit of hope and luck back towards the main road through uncharted territory, avoiding the piles of boar dung and praying that we didn't stray into a group of them basking in one of the many wallows we passed. I've since been back to the site. I was there last weekend to set out my game camera nearby, and there is no cabin. Whatever we saw was a Fata Morgana of sorts, but I often think what would have happened if we'd found the cabin there and entered. Would we have disappeared also when it did? Were we lucky to have got caught in the undergrowth shortly before we reached an object that doesn't permanently exist on our plane? Or perhaps it was just the memory of a cabin that had once stood there, a ghost, and its appearance and disappearance was related to the obvious death of nature that surrounded it. Whatever had happened there had left an imprint, and I'm honestly glad we didn't find that cabin and go in. I'm used to living around large wild animals. In fact, it's not uncommon for them to visit my garden. In winter, deer break through the fence to shred my young fruit trees. I even got my Jack Russell Terrier specifically because of our fox problem. Their frequent visits had led them to lose their fear of people and even become aggressive. Sandy, my Jack Russell, goes straight for them and sends them running for safety. At this time of year, the red deer stag rut, I frequently encounter crazed giant stags, mostly bolting across roads as their hormones override their sense of self-preservation. At this time of year, they're also dangerous, as they'll attack anyone foolish enough to get too close to them. Every couple of years, someone is killed locally by a testosterone-pumped stag. Also, at this time of year, it's quite common to encounter wild boar as they raid the recently harvested sweet corn fields. and wild boar are always potentially dangerous. Just the other night, while driving home, we encountered a sow on the road. She literally just stood there, staring down the car, until her 2 young piglets had safely crossed. Then all 3 disappeared into the brush. She had no fear whatsoever of a 1.5-ton vehicle when her young one's safety was at risk. Thankfully, we didn't encounter the same situation whilst on foot in the forest. There are lynx and wolves in the area. This year, the villagers are frightened of going into the forest to pick mushrooms because there are so many wolves. And brown or grizzly bear have been caught on trail cam only a couple of miles from my house, in the same stretch of forest that I frequent. But these are the beasts that I know about and am accustomed to seeing and photographing regularly. I know their habits and their characteristics, and I can easily identify all of them. Last night was a different situation entirely. My house is in a small village in a remote valley in the Carpathian Mountains. My garden backs onto a meadow which leads up a hill to a forest. The meadow is bordered on all sides by forest. At certain times of the year, the meadow resembles the Serengeti, with herds of large animals roaming and grazing, and even the occasional pack of wolves racing along the tree line. The only thing separating my dwelling from wilderness is a 6-foot-high chain-link fence, currently held up by forked sticks as the deer keep crushing it. Despite our isolation, I generally feel safe, as I have means to humanely remove any unwanted critters or even intruders from my property. Safety precautions accepted and practiced universally out here. In the past, I've stepped out with the dog at night to let him relieve himself before bed, and almost bumped into a red deer stag just standing outside my door. Okay, I get a brief jump scare, but this is quickly overridden by the excitement of such a close encounter with a magnificent creature, although they're not so magnificent when they stand under your window bellowing and baying all night long. My point is that, after almost 3 decades of isolated living and pitch-black nights filled with the scratching, running and screaming of pine martens and edible dormice above my head in the attic, there's very little nature can scare me with. But last night, I was scared. We didn't get home until after 6 p.m, meaning there was little time before darkness fell to get the fires lit and sort out dinner. It's getting very cold at night now, sometimes dipping below 0, so heating up the place is a major priority. There was also a very heavy rainfall, which makes everything feel damp. As the single street lamp is seldom switched on, and last night it wasn't, and as the rain clouds completely covered the moon, it was very dark outside by 7 p.m. We have 2 entrances, but the main one we generally never use, favouring instead the kitchen door which leads directly into the garden. It's a heavy security door but has one major design flaw, a viewing window to let light in. At around 8 p.m, whilst we were all in the kitchen and its surroundings, my Jack Russell started growling at the door. Jack Russells are extremely vocal and hyperactive and stubborn dogs, with a wide range of barks, growls and yips they use to convey their wishes and opinions. Sandy's want to go out call is a series of high-pitched barks. A visitor would have induced frantic racing about, mostly in circles, jumping onto the window ledge and then lots of barking. Instead, he was facing the door, front legs lowered, heckles raised, growling fiercely. We'd never seen him do this before. Ever. It was such an unusual sight that it took me a while just to register what it could imply, that there was something outside the door. We were all in the kitchen and, beyond the door, only a few feet away, was something that had set my dog off into a killing, fearful rage. My mind raced through the possibilities. A person, a deer, a boar, most likely a fox. I grabbed an axe, opened the door and stepped out into the heavy downpour and the smothering darkness. I even forgot to bring a flashlight. I will reiterate, it was very, very dark. and all I could hear was rain hitting various objects, overriding all of the sounds. And then I heard a crashing off to my left. Sandy, without me registering it, the second I had opened the door, had bolted up the slope in the garden. As he is mostly white, I could see him fairly well 15 feet away. It was then that my brain registered what he was doing and what was actually happening. Beside the weak light coming from the viewing window in the kitchen door and some light escaping from behind the curtain in the kitchen window, my eyes had to strain to see what was going on. There was a chase. Sandy in pursuit of, I have no idea what. Whatever it was, it covered 30 feet of wet grass and cleared a 6-foot fence in the time it took me to shout, "What the f-?" Whatever it was dark-coloured and extremely bulky. I could judge its size as Sandy was repeatedly gnashing at its lower legs, beneath its hocks, which were above his head height, meaning the creature was very, very large. I cursed myself for not bringing a flashlight and ran to where my terrier was throwing himself at the fence, trying to pursue whatever his foe had been. Because of the rain and Sandy's incessant barking and growling, I couldn't hear anything else. Whatever it was, it had gone. After a few minutes, I returned to the kitchen door, completely soaked through. There were 2 clues as options as to what the creature might have been doing there, so close to people speaking. A half-filled trash bag we'd left outside, meaning it was scavenging, or the viewing window, meaning it had been watching us. There wasn't a scratch on the trash bag. One other aspect which I'd managed to register in the few microseconds that I'd witnessed the chase. The creature had run like a man. A bear would be the natural answer, but too many things didn't fit, especially at clearing a 6-foot fence in one bound. The incident really shook us all up, and none of us slept well, especially as the wind picked up in the night and tree branches banged against the guttering and windows. Whatever it was still out there. A couple of years ago, my friend John and I had been sitting in the garden during the day when a dense fog rolled in. The grass in the meadow beyond the fence was very, very high, chest height. Out of nowhere, we heard this ungodly bellowing and screaming as something massive crashed its way at rapid speed through the fog-hidden field. It was all over in a flash, but it left us confused and concerned as to what it could have been. There are creatures out here that you won't find in any guide or wildlife book. There are creatures, the possible existence of which is too scary to contemplate. And one of them may have been watching my family through the window. As always, be free.